So that is why, for us, it's very important to ensure that we continue to strengthen, that we continue to recover, in some instances, indigenous systems of governments everywhere. One of our leaders would always remind us by saying, you go negotiate through a system that is not yours, where do you expect to end up? You're not going to end up in your communities. You're going to end up somewhere else because that system is designed to take you somewhere else. I think there's wisdom to take away from that as well.
This is the Go Maluku podcast.
All right, everyone. Welcome to a new video podcast with Ghazali Ohorella with the Go Maluku podcast with me, a very good friend of mine, Pablo Belize. I think you're way better in terms of introducing yourself than I can. So, what is the? Let's start with the basics. The origin story of Pablo.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's a pleasure sharing. My name is Pablo Mis. I am Maya Ekchi, so greetings to everyone from the lands of the Maya people in southern Belize. I come from a very small community called Laguna. It is a Ekchi community where almost everybody in my community still speak our language. It's something that we try to safeguard, and I think it speaks power to its application in many of the contentious and contested spaces that we find ourselves on a daily basis with, trying to ensure that our dignity as indigenous people remains. So that's where I come from. I am part of the effort by the Maya people's leadership to secure our rights on our land. We are a land-based people. In other words, we're only able to understand ourselves, understand our purpose, understand our being on this earth if we're able to have our freedom on the land that allows us to develop and to generate and to create and recreate our identity as Maya people. So I work along with the traditional leaders, the Alcalde, the Holomilk Alebal, the Polilka, we call them in our languages. And our struggle for rights to land goes back to over 30 years of direct negotiations and eventually litigation.
Right. So that's a little bit of the the backstory, the background of Pablo. Tell people that a little bit about yourself, when you grew up. Little Pablo. How was Pablo when he grew up in the community?
Those are the fun days, I always say. And I think it's really those experiences that shapes my appreciation of the challenges now that I see in terms of us trying to continue being Maya, sustaining who we are as a people. I come from a family of 8, and I'm the oldest. And we are a farming family, which means that much of our needs in terms of food, shelter, is sourced from the land and from the forest. So we did a lot of farming, corn, rice, cacao. We have right now a very beautiful plot of agroforestry land that is able to give us cacao, coffee, nutmeg, mami, you can name all the fruits. Really now understanding that when I was a child and we were accompanying my mom and my dad planting in those fields, now I can see the wisdom as to why we needed to be doing that, because now I can enjoy those fruits. But beyond that, my children, the grandchildren now of my parents, are also able to enjoy the fruits of the land coming from the hard work that was done years ago. So that has been my history, and that continues to be who I am outside of all this technical work that I'm now involved in.
Right. And what is your do you have a utopian view, like a future vision for the Maya people, for yourself maybe? Do you have that something?
Definitely. I think that the dream. We always say the dream. Our dream as a Maya people is to be free on our lands,
right?
Where all of us, and if not all of us, but the greater majority of us, can have a fair chance at life.
Right.
And we don't ask for much. As I mentioned earlier, we are a very hardworking people, and we believe that so long as we're able to preserve our freedom on our land, we will be able to make a decent life for our families. Now, I also say that in the context that as Maya people, we also call ourselves Ralchoch. Ralchoch, actually translated into English, means the children of the earth.
Right.
So I say all of what I said just now in the context that it is not based on the idea of exploiting the land and the resources as well. In other words, if we were to do that, we would be harming ourselves as Ralchoch. So I also see that our dream as a people is one where we are able to have healthy lands, healthy forests, because it is only by having that can we be a healthy people as well.
Right.
So that is a part of the dream, I think, that we have as Maya people. Maybe there's a last part to it as well. Times are changing. Indigenous peoples have always innovated. We are a people of innovation. The Maya history, as you will know, our ancestors created the calendar, created the numbering system. They built amazing architectures.
Right.
So the legacy of innovation is there. And the Maya people right now, having secured rights to land, are also dreaming of building a Maya economy that also preserves the values and the principles of reciprocity. In other words, what we are able to give is what we can get back. And we're envisioning all of this in the context that we must be able to maintain healthy forests, healthy lands, and healthy people.
Right. And how does this vision that you have, like probably it's hard work, one of the things that you're super strong about is governance, right? The Maya governance system, how does that work?
So the Maya system of governance, it's now called the Alcalde system, and that name was adopted when the Spaniards had encounters with the Maya people, and the only way they can label or give title to a community leader is based on their knowledge of, for instance, the tongue mayor, and that the mayor translated into English is alcalde. But they are traditionally known, their titles are the Polilka, the Holomil Kalebal, which means the one who leads on the path or the head of the community.
Right.
Now, we've always managed our affairs as indigenous people, pre-contact. We've always been an organized people. None of the innovations that I just spoke about can ever happen without very organized communities. So I emphasize that because it is not that we're asking now to develop our own system of governance. What we're saying in the context of the Maya people is that we have already something in place. We want to be able to have the freedom to continue to ensure that our system of governance continues to evolve so that it can remain relevant, that it can remain responsive to our communities. Because our priorities are also shifting, but our fundamental, our core values don't. And we believe strongly that we can only be able to build strong indigenous communities anchored, rooted in our principles and our values through systems of governance that itself emerges on the basis and the principles of those same values that I'm talking about. So that is why, for us, it's very important to ensure that we continue to strengthen, that we continue to recover, in some instances, indigenous systems of governments everywhere. One of our leaders would always remind us by saying, you go negotiate through a system that is not yours, where do you expect to end up? You're not going to end up in your communities. You're going to end up somewhere else because that system is designed to take you somewhere else. I think there's wisdom to take away from that as well.
Right. So is there any, there's quite a number of indigenous governance systems out there. Is there anything that No, sir. Let me ask you a bit different question, which is more relevant to this. Is how is the relationship or the interaction between the indigenous governance system and the central government of Belize?
A very important question. I think one as well that as indigenous peoples, based on our context, it differs. In the case of the Mayas of southern Belize, there is a day-to-day engagement between the community leadership and central government in a variety of ways. For instance, the Forest Department on a day-to-day basis is looking at issues related to the forest.
Right.
What we see now, though, is that the Forest Department cannot go into a community and do as it wants.
Mm-hmm.
It must go through the system of governance of the Maya people, or
Right.
at times they accompany the traditional leaders of the communities, because communities themselves have their own customary rules related to forest and its use. So there is a day-to-day engagement there. Now, I think that for us as well, we are very clear that international law and standards have now established and accepted widely by many countries, including Belize, that indigenous peoples, because of what I said earlier, because we've always had our own system, that in today's time we have an inherent right to develop our own system of governance. And we try to make sure then that that is understood as well by central government. I want to say clearly, though, that I mentioned earlier that it depends on the context. In the context of Belize, we're not saying that we're going to be a state within a state. What we're saying is that we need to be able to build respectful relationship between the Maya people's leadership and the leadership of central government. We need to be able to harmonize, we need to be able to create synergies between our priorities as indigenous peoples and those at the national level. Because at the end of the day, much of it actually is not very different if we're thinking about the public good or the common good. Mm-hmm. Our aim is, for instance, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Our aim is to do better at managing our resources, at combating climate change. And if you look at what our philosophy as indigenous people, it speaks to the heart of the same aims that the nation has. But the way we go about achieving them are different, so it requires us to respect processes that we have that are in place, including those processes that are of the indigenous peoples, like the Maya people.
Right. So what are the major challenges that the Maya people face? Like you talk about rights, you talk about environment, sustainable development. What is the pitch? What are the biggest challenges that you face right now?
I mean, as much as I speak about what we have and what we've been able to retain as the Maya people, I think our challenges are the same as indigenous people globally. Mm-hmm. The ongoing attempts to dispossess us of our land is one of the biggest challenges. That's done through a variety of ways, either by government trying to say that they have direct control and authority over those lands, or by giving out concessions, whether logging or for mining, or by selling lands to land speculators. So you see that as one of the biggest threat. Mm-hmm. And those threats now are actually evolving as well into more silent ones. For instance, we're here at talking about climate change.
Yeah.
Carbon rights, for instance, now is trying to be defined. Governments are trying to define it in isolation of land tenure. That again is a threat. Then again, that kind of eventually lead us down the path of dispossession of land. So that's one. I think the other major challenge is really the appreciation by central government and development agencies as well of indigenous dreams of the future, and the inability to make those equal or part of the development agenda.
Right.
So that's another area of challenge that we see on a day-to-day basis that we have to be working along with our government to raise awareness on and to try to bridge the gap that exists. And maybe another major threat as well is the ongoing efforts to either dilute or to remove the capacity of indigenous peoples to be able to organize themselves and make decisions through their own processes. Again, it goes back to the issue of governance.
Right.
So that's an ongoing threat that I think we face in the Maya communities. And lastly, perhaps the issue of lack of financial resources. There's no denying that indigenous communities do not exist in isolation. We do not exist as an island. And you see this rapid transition of society from subsistent or shared labor economies to now cash economy. And the pace at which that is happening, have indigenous people kind of running behind the train,
Right.
wanting to get on the train, and in the process giving up a lot that has actually given them security in the past. So there's a need for indigenous people's economic systems to be considered as well as we talk about trying to get more direct access to cash to indigenous peoples.
Right. How do you see the role of the International Indigenous Peoples movement in all this?
Well, it's fundamental. I think that, well, let me start out by saying this. One of our former chief, Mr. Alfonso Cala, always tells me, Pablo, don't get worried, he says, our problems are not going to be solved in Geneva or New York. So don't get worried about the complications of getting there. Our problems will only be solved at the community level.
Right.
And I say that in the context that there are, of course, opportunities at various levels. You cannot just operate at one level. You have to be able to operate at the various levels. At the international platform, for instance, international indigenous advocacy have been able to open doors, have been able to, as we have been saying over the last few days, create hooks or put hooks in there that we can later then work on to further interpret how they're applicable to the various realities of indigenous peoples on the ground.
Right.
In the context of the Maya, for instance, in part, our success in the courts to secure legal protection for our lands comes off the back of the spaces now available to indigenous peoples in the human rights platform within the United Nations system, within the OAS system. Why do I say that? Because there's multiple recommendations coming from the UPR, from CERD, from the human rights treaty bodies, from the special procedures,
Right.
urging Belize over the many years to comply with its international human rights obligation. And so we then at the local level are able to use that to show the court that there is some level of global consensus that Belize needs to do better at protecting the Maya people's rights. That is an example of how the international indigenous people's advocacy is useful to indigenous peoples on the ground, but it requires the building of capacity on the ground to be able to utilize these windows that are open at the international level.
Right. All right. Pablo, take us back to the very first time you went to a UN meeting. How scared was you? Like, is it like, were you scared shitless, or was it like, how did you feel?
Well, I have to tell you that I was lost.
Oh, okay.
I felt lost. Not lost in the sense of not knowing what I came to do,
Okay.
but lost in the sense of not knowing which way to turn or which way to go to get to the place that I am supposed to be going.
Right.
Imagine my first trip was to Geneva. I land at the airport. I need to take a bus to a certain point,
Yeah.
and then get on the tram to go somewhere else. I look around. There's nowhere to pay. You have to put money in a box to get a ticket.
No,
You don't know which bus to take.
Yeah.
You don't have Google Maps. So you're right there. You're trying to talk to people. It's a good thing in Geneva, actually, people understand a lot of English.
International, yeah.
So they're able to explain. But feeling lost. Feeling lost, I think, was what I felt there. That's at the just landing, and then within the quarters of the review of Belize, for instance, I think I came for the human rights bodies review of Belize. You know, we indigenous people like to talk, and we can talk for hours. Normally we talk about the moon, the rain, the sun.
And it's not just people from Belize, though, but it's indigenous people in
indigenous
general.
people in general. And then we get to our point.
Yeah.
But in these hearings, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So there's also that's also very intimidating. How am I able to get
Yeah.
my message across in 2 minutes? And then the leaders expect you to be able to get the message across.
Right.
Again, a very intimidating space within the corridors of the UN trying to utilize the processes.
Right.
Again, it goes back to the point of the need for capacity for indigenous peoples to be able to utilize those spaces effectively.
What did you wish when you first went to that? Because it was a UPR, or was what kind of process was that? when
That
you
was
went to
the Human Rights
Human Rights Committee?
Yeah, committee.
All right. So, retrospect, what is something that you wished you knew back then that would have helped a lot?
Well, one was that I wish that I understood how the system worked. That I wish that I understood how to go about preparing my statement, understanding the procedures, and those kind of things. That's one thing that I hoped I'd wish. Actually, after that, I did apply for the fellowship.
Okay.
Because I learned at that time that there are opportunities within the UN, and the fellowship then basically allowed me to build a greater understanding of the entire UN system,
Right.
specifically on indigenous people. And this is why this morning again I shared on my Facebook page and on our work Facebook page, urging other indigenous people to make use of the opportunities within the UN Voluntary Fund, because it is only by accessing those that you can begin to build capacity, and those capacities can become very crucial in terms of how you move strategically the work of protecting indigenous rights at the community level.
Well, what is the main takeaway from you when you went to do the fellowship program?
Well, it built a better understanding. It built my understanding in terms of how the various mechanism work. So when you talk, for instance, about the UPR and the Human Rights Council,
Yeah.
that's a whole system in itself. So I was able to understand how it works. When you talk about the treaty bodies as well, how they operate, the special procedure, the rapporteurs, those kind of things. Understanding, for instance, like CERD, when you can demand, for instance, for early warnings and those kind of support that exists.
Yeah.
So those for me were very critical, because they're most relevant to how we can use them in the context of our advocacy with a government that at that time was simply not responsive to the issues of indigenous peoples.
Right. Okay. And so you did the fellowship program, which was a half a year, quite a while ago, but I don't know what the current the length of the fellowship program.
It was about 3 months.
3 months, right?
Yeah,
so
I think it's like half a year for the Spanish and
all right. Yeah.
speaking beneficiaries, I believe.
And then now you're the board of trustees of the voluntary fund.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've been fortunate to then continue my participation and engagement in the UN system. I've been following the work of MRIP. In fact, we have submitted to the thematic studies that they've done as they relate to the situation of the Maya people in southern Belize. Similarly, we have followed the Permanent Forum, participated now quite a bit in the climate change as well efforts, and I think all of that led to to my nomination to be a part of the Board of Trustees for the UN Voluntary Fund, a position that I'm honored to take on, and I hope that more of our constituent members in the Caribbean and Latin America can access or even just build their awareness of the fund, because recently the fund has now expanded its mandate to support the participation of indigenous communities now in the climate change process, climate change talks, the climate change negotiations that are ongoing, because it is recognized that the impacts of climate change is a direct threat against the human rights of indigenous peoples, and beyond that, the ability of indigenous peoples to continue surviving as indigenous peoples. The mandate has also been expanded to support work under the human rights and business portfolio. Again, recognizing that there is a need for development and business that's happening on indigenous territories to more and more comply with human rights standards. And one of the ways that that can be done is when indigenous peoples are able to build their capacity in that area, then they become a part of the process of supporting all those involved in upholding human rights in business.
Right. Assuming this is your first climate change meeting, right? And at least under the UNFCCC, is that the
well? I
first
was not necessarily. I was. I participated in the 2015 Paris.
The big one.
The big one.
Where
there was a lot of. I think it was a turning moment for the negotiations. A lot of indigenous peoples there. So yeah, I've been able to follow that, and at the national level as well, we're very much engaged in this discussion, because we know that Belize has a keen interest as a country in the entire climate change negotiations, including the mitigation and adaptation proposals.
Right. So what were your expectations before you got to Bonn? This substa meeting, intersessionals. What were your thoughts?
Well, for me,
expectations.
It's twofold. One is I'm here to support the beneficiaries of the fund, and one of the aims we have is to understand better how the resources of the fund can be effectively and efficiently used to support indigenous people's participation. So we're doing an assessment of what's happening here in Bonn in terms of the participation of beneficiaries. So that's one. And I'm here as well as a part of, on behalf of the Maya people. And in that field, as I said, Belize, who has a delegation here, has been aggressively pursuing climate change adaptation and mitigation support. We've been able to work along with the government to include language in the NDC of Belize that now makes reference to indigenous peoples. Of course, as it is the case with many indigenous peoples, while we're able to get language in there, how we use the language in the actual implementation of the national plans is actually going to tell us our report card. So my hope here is to continue joining the efforts of the global platform of indigenous peoples in our advocacy to ensure that human rights is rooted in how climate change mitigation, adaptation is operationalized,
right?
And that it also ensures that it considers direct support, direct resources, direct financing to indigenous peoples. So I was looking forward to being a part of the conversation and the advocacy with the other indigenous peoples here to advance those points. Also because in the case of Belize, those very points will be the points that we will have to continue as well advocating at the national level with our government.
So you've the day 3 right now. You've seen a facilitated working group at work. You see the caucus at work, caucus meetings, preparatory meeting. What else? Strategy meetings and informal meetings. So what are your impressions of this whole climate change podium what we as indigenous peoples are operating on?
Yeah. Well, I think for us as indigenous peoples, there certainly has been an increasing level of capacity to organize ourselves in terms of where are the priority areas to act on. So we've all witnessed the caucus in action, the caucus being very efficient in either developing position papers or advocacy papers, and in being able to circulate those position and advocacy papers to member states or to parties. So that I think is something to acknowledge and to give credit to the indigenous leaders that have been and that continue to be a part of the organizing of the indigenous peoples at this level, because it's not a friendly space to be. In fact, we all know that this is not a space that welcomed the indigenous peoples in the beginning.
No.
But this level of coordination by indigenous peoples, I think, continues to break barriers and continues to create that space.
Yeah.
I've also been very impressed by the ability of the caucus to follow the various thematic areas and to go beyond that by engaging in informal meetings with various parties and establishing common understanding. So while indigenous representatives are not able to enter the negotiation rooms, at least there is some level of confidence that there are parties that will bring those issues to the table because it's also in their interest. So I think that there's a level of very good coordination that is happening amongst indigenous peoples at this level.
Right. Anything you're looking forward to the next? Because you will be here for the next for the entirety of Substa. Anything you look forward to? Anything you're keen to discover?
Well, I think that as the weeks go by, we begin to understand who is here, who is interested in what. I look forward to, for instance, more of the bilateral informal meetings because it provides us an insight of what is going on in those closed rooms, what are the questions that is lingering, and I think I look forward to understanding those so that we can again continue to look at how we can better position the priorities of indigenous peoples within the framework of the priorities as well of many friendly states that are in these negotiations. So I look forward to more of those kind of meetings.
Well, let me end up with the final question. Something that came up during the conversation. And I'd love to hear your take on it. What to you, and it doesn't have to be like a very legal answer, but like what is to you? What is traditional / indigenous knowledge?
Indigenous people's knowledge. Let's see. I mean,
I like how you reframed it. Indigenous people's knowledge. Yeah.
We, I think, have always been clear that we are a people that have innovated, that have created, and that is a practice that we continue to do, because if we were not able to do that, we would not continue to exist as indigenous people. Now, when we talk of those innovations, when we talk about creating, recreating our existence as indigenous people, we're talking about the things we know, the things that we understand, we're talking about our priorities, we're talking about our principles, our values, and combined together, our awareness that it will sustain us as a people. So my humble take on indigenous knowledge rests within that understanding. And and I think it is because of this kind of understanding that often, I think I heard somebody or a state member saying, I don't remember the exact language, is it true science? What was the language that was used?
Yeah, true science.
Something
yeah.
to that effect. But essentially, already they're positioning contemporary knowledge, contemporary science as more valid than the millennial knowledge, the millennial know-how of our people. So there's a need to bridge that gap. I think there's a need to include indigenous people's knowledge, traditional knowledge in the planning, in the conceptualization of not only projects but policies, because it has sustained the remaining 80% of the biodiversity that we have. It has sustained cultures that goes back to hundreds of years. So there must be some wisdom. And
We
some
must have done
relevance
something
in it.
right. Yeah.
We must be doing, and we must have done something right.
Right. Yeah.
Correct.
Absolutely. Pablo, we have a meeting in a little bit, so we must end it up. Any final thoughts? Words of wisdom.
I think that the work that we're engaged in as indigenous people is one that is not owned by any one indigenous people's group or any one person. This is a collective effort. As much as we come from different regions of the world, our ability to come together like this at these platforms allows us to pool our knowledge together and put forward very, very clear and very strong positions. And we do this not because of our own interests, but because there's been some right in it in the past, and we want to be able to lean on that to enable us to have healthy indigenous peoples, a healthy world going into the future. So I'd encourage indigenous peoples to continue being engaged, particularly young people. It is not an easy place to be. It's not perhaps the most glamorous and rewarding space. We were talking a short while ago with a Sami colleague who was explaining that in this kind of work with indigenous people, you're no attorney, but you need to know a little bit of everything, from climate change, forest protection, sustainable development, governance, land rights. So it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to be able to orient yourself in those various areas. But we need you. We need you, the young people. We need you, our indigenous brothers and sisters, to hold the hope and to keep being a part of the process.
All right. Well said, Pablo. All right. Thank you so much.
All right.